and I welcome Professor Jeffery Frankel from the Harvard University, and I give the floor to my colleague, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much, Professor Frankel, for joining us from far away, and thank you very much, Felipe, Professor. I hope you can stay with us for follow the discussion. You know who you are in English, so let me read your CV in Spanish, Professor Frankel, okay?
Yes, certainly.
Professor, bueno? Hello? Do you agree or do you understand Spanish, Jeff?
I don't speak Spanish very well, unfortunately. I should because I grew up in California, but I don't. Go ahead, though.
Welcome. California will be ours one day, so don't worry.
It used to be.
El profesor Jeffery Frankel es el James Harper Professor de Formación de Capital y Crecimiento de la Kennedy School of Government de la Universidad de Harvard. Durante 25 años fue investigador asociado en la Oficina Nacional de Investigación Económica en el NBER, donde formó parte del Comité de Fechado de Ciclos Económicos. 25 años ahí. En los periodos de 83-84 y 96-99 también participó en el Consejo de Asesores Económicos, el CEA, del presidente de los Estados Unidos. Tiene una carrera muy prolífica tanto como académico como policy advisor al más alto nivel. Como miembro del CEA en la administración Clinton, las responsabilidades del profesor incluían economía internacional, macroeconomía y medio ambiente. En 1999, antes de su llegada a Harvard, fue profesor de economía en la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Nació en San Francisco, bellísima ciudad, se graduó en el Swarthmore College y recibió su PhD en economía por el MIT. Sus líneas de investigación son conocidas por todos aquí, pero las menciono. Incluye materias primas, crisis, divisas, política fiscal, finanzas internacionales, política monetaria, bloques regionales, temas ambientales y podría yo seguirle. REPEC lo sitúa entre los 50 economistas más citados y no solamente REPEC. Escribe una columna mensual en Project Syndicate y tiene un blog y bueno, coordina cualquier cantidad de conferencias y ha formado un enorme número de alumnos tanto de América Latina como del mundo. Welcome, Jeff. Your turn.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to take the occasion to thank CIDE and EGE for inviting me to this conference on business cycle dating committees. I was a member of the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee for 25 years. I just stepped down off of that 1 month ago, so I'm fresh from that. I should emphasize I'm not speaking for the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee. We decided to pre-record a half-hour video. I'm working with new hardware and software here, video conferencing hardware and software, and I was a bit risk-averse. So if everything goes right, we'll run the video, and I'm adjusting to the equipment a little bit, but I think it should work fine. The overall theme of my comments are the pros and cons of having a panel like the CEPR one we've just heard about, or the NBER panel called Business Cycle Turning Points, based on a variety of information, not just looking at GDP and going well beyond the standard rule of 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. I understand I've been listening for a little while. You've been talking about these issues and the trade-off between waiting and not and all that. I think my perspective is perhaps a little bit unique in that we make these decisions in real time, and we get a lot of attention out of the United States, being big and important. When the committee calls a trough or calls a peak, it makes newspaper headlines and has a big effect, and so it kind of gives you a different perspective that might not be obvious from the outside looking in. But anyway, I'll rejoin you in half an hour for live discussion, comments, and Q&A. But let's try to run the video now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll do so.
Corre video.
Good afternoon. I think it's a great idea that CIDE and NEGI have called together this symposium on, or seminar on business cycle dating, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate. I'm only sorry that I'm not able to join you in Mexico City in person due to my teaching schedule, but hopefully modern technology will solve that problem. Opening the panel on international experiences from the USA and Canada, um, the number one question that we are posed is why are business cycle committees needed? And that is a specific question that I have been called upon to answer many times in the 25 years that I was a member of the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee. Let me take the occasion to say I'm not speaking on behalf of the Business Cycle Dating Committee. I would say when we called a turning point and would speak to called upon to answer questions from the press, perhaps the most common question we were asked was, why do we need a business cycle dating committee? I thought the rule was 2 negative quarters. Typically, the journalist asking the question had not been on the same beat at the last recession, the last business cycle, and in some cases didn't know that the NBR Business Cycle Dating Committee existed. But despite the fact, and I'm going to explain later why we get asked the question so much, who needs a panel, who needs a committee, because I think I do have a particular perspective on it by virtue of my experience on the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee, which it's quite different if you've actually done it. You can't necessarily figure it out. I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. But anyway, despite the fact that people ask the question, the turning points, the troughs, and the peaks, the trough being the beginning of a recession, the peak being the beginning of a recession, and the trough being the end of a recession. The turning points that are called by the NBER are followed, are reported, the headlines in the newspapers and online news sites, and they enter the official chronology. They're what everyone uses thereafter, whether it's an econometric scholar doing research on the causes or effects of recessions, or it's a politician giving a speech trying to blame his opponent's party for a recession or whatever. Everybody virtually accepts the chronology of the NBER, and this is something different in the United States than most other countries. I think it is useful to have everyone working off of a common set of dates for the set of turning points for the economy, rather than making up their own. I mean, researchers will do whatever they think best, but for most purposes, you don't want your results to depend on your particular interpretation of when was a recession and when wasn't. And you want to be able to rely on a common set of dates. So I think that's a good thing. The NBER, of course, is not part of the government. It's a private, nonprofit research institution. The official status of the turning points declared by the NBER is confirmed by the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's the government bureau that puts out the GDP statistics, among other things. It says on their website, quote, "The designation of a recession is the province of a committee of experts at the NBER, a private nonprofit research organization." So that is an official premature on the rulings of the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee. And whenever you see, for example, a graph, a government publication or anywhere else, the shaded areas that represent recessions, those are the delineated by the pronouncements of the NPR Business Cycle Dating Committee. We've declared 10 turning points, 5 recessions, each with begun by a peak and ended with a trough since the committee was constituted. And nobody questions it. Let me take a concrete example. The recession of 2001. Everyone accepts that there was a recession in 2001. Well, guess what? It wasn't 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. It certainly wasn't at the time that we called it as a recession. It was a big negative quarter, and then a slight positive quarter, and then another big negative quarter. There was a period after some GDP revisions when it was 2 consecutive quarters. But I believe after later revisions, the current statistics, historically, if you go back and look at 2001, you'll find it's not 2 negative quarters. Everybody accepts that it's a recession nonetheless. And that's interesting. I mean, there is a corollary, by the way. The fact that everyone accepts that that's a recession in 2001 means everyone accepts that until now, the longest U.S. expansion on record has been a 10-year period, 120 months, starting in March 1991 and ending in March 2001. If a recession didn't start in March 2001, then that expansion continued, and the record U.S. expansion under that interpretation would have lasted 16 and a half years, which is 201 months, from March 1991 all the way up to December 2007, which, I mean, is kind of interesting. It would say that the current expansion, for example, has not broken a new record. Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I think that the correct accepted definitions of recessions are the NPR Business Cycle Dating Committee. And 2001 was a recession, but I just say it by way of illustration of how accepted the rulings are, even when they don't comport with the rule of 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. Well, let me give a little bit of institutional and historical background on the NPR Business Cycle Dating Committee. There is a chronology from the NBER that goes all the way back to 1854, and it used to be the main task of the NBER, but economic historians working away in anonymity. It didn't become there wasn't a committee appointed or established until 1978, which is the year that Martin Feldstein took over the NBER and essentially mostly moved it from New York to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and made it into a much more ambitious enterprise, but of course kept the responsibilities for business cycle dating and appointed a committee of scholars who were NBER affiliates to be on the committee and make those calls. The committee's first press release was July 27, 1979, and there were some questions about whether the economy was slowing down then and whether this was a recession. And the committee said no, they weren't prepared to call it as a recession, and they said one of the things we're looking at is employment, which is still strong. So right from the beginning, you have that departure from relying on the GDP statistics solely. The designation of the membership of the committee is the prerogative of the president of the NBER, who's now Jim Paterba. The membership of the committee fluctuates. If I'm remembering correctly, I think the lowest it's gotten is 6. Not sure about that. The highest it's gotten is 10. And Bob Hall of Stanford University has been the chairman of the committee ever since it began in 1978. Well, the U.S. system is fundamentally different from the way recessions are determined in most other countries. As is widely known, most countries use a simple rule of 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in GDP for determining a recession. This conference, a background memo from CIDE and the program of the conference testify that there are other countries, it's not just the U.S., who have established committees. The CEPR has a business cycle dating committee, perhaps modeled on the NBER, that calls recessions for the euro area. And C.D. Howe Institute in Canada, apparently also Spain, Brazil. Most of these countries' committees so far, as far as I know, operate differently than the NBR, and that they do not have the official imprimatur of their respective governments. If there's not some degree of official buy-in, it's a different exercise. I salute these committees and their efforts, and perhaps they will get more official recognition. And I'm not going to say that what they're engaged in is a purely academic exercise, but it is my impression that the findings of most of the other committees don't receive a lot of attention in the press or the media when they are announced, and I don't receive official recognition from their national governments. By the way, Japan is one of the very few other countries that has a committee, departs from a mechanical rule of 2/4 of negative GDP. They look at other indicators like employment and so on, but it is official. It's part of the official government in the cabinet office. Perhaps, as I said, perhaps some of these other committees will receive more public attention and get official notice as time goes by, as happened with the NBER. So now, a very good question. Why not follow the standard rule that most countries follow, that a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth? I think maybe examples illustrate the point the best. I've already given one example, that some of the U.S. recessions, the recession of 2001, seems pretty clearly to have been a recession, but it did not at the time and does not now, I believe, satisfy the criterion of 2 negative quarters consecutive, because they were separated by an intermediate quarter, which was a slightly positive growth. Let me give a different kind of example. The rule of 2 consecutive negative quarters says that Italy has had 3 or 4 separate recessions since 2007. I say 3 or 4, depending on revisions in the data. But if you look at the graph of the GDP, I think you would say that it's been one big recession. Italy's GDP has yet to reattain the pre-recession peak, the 2007 peak. It's still quite a ways below that, let alone if you wanted to allow for any trend in potential GDP in the meantime. I think if we applied the NBER's approach, one would say it was one big recession. I think that would give you the right answer. And I think there's a similar story for, not quite as dramatic, but for Ireland, that the 2 negative quarters in 2013 would say that was a recession, whereas if you look at the larger picture, you've got to say that was just a bump in the middle of a longer lasting recession. Well, not only does the NBR refrain from using the 2 negative quarters rule, it also looks at a lot more than just GDP. It looks at other variables as well. I would say the second most important indicator, particularly important in real time, is employment. And there are some members of our committee who place tremendous weight on that. And it is important. I personally am actually fond, by the way, of total hours worked, which is the number of people employed times the average length of the work week. Just seems to me that if there's a fall in the demand for labor, that firms start cutting back on overtime or cutting workers to below 40 hours a week before they start firing them. So it's a more conceptually, it perhaps is a little bit more of a leading indicator, but that's just maybe just a personal interest of mine. On the list of indicators that the NBR website will show you if you look that besides GDP and employment, industrial production gets special attention, so does real personal income. And in practice, other variables have been used. Retail sales used to be important. There's other variables that are looked at. Having said that, that the committee looks at other variables than GDP. GDP does have special significance. It is sort of ultimately what we're interested in. And I want to make 3 points about GDP in particular. First, even GDP, aside from the revisions, has some conceptual ambiguities. By the time of the Great Recession, the NBR committee had come around to the viewpoint that it was a mistake to rely solely on the product side measure of GDP. The product side measure is the familiar C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and it's the one that's always reported that everyone looks at. There's also an income side measure. That's the one that's labor compensation plus capital income plus taxes. In theory, the two should be the same. Output should equal income. In practice, they're measured differently, and there's a statistical discrepancy. And for the case of the U.S., there's pretty good information, pretty good evidence that the income side measure is at least as informative, if not more informative, than the product side measure, even though it gets virtually no attention. And in 2015, 4 years ago, the Bureau of Economic Analysis finally started publishing a series called The Average of GDP and GDI, Gross Domestic Product, on the output side and gross domestic income. That's kind of an awkward phrase. The Council of Economic Advisors of the President christened this measure GDO for gross domestic output. Well, this is a number that the Business Cycle Dating Committee had been using for some time. By the time of the Great Recession, we had already decided that it was worth paying attention to the income side measure, and that did factor into the deliberations in calling the recession. Another point is a major reason why employment and the other indicators receive weight in real time is that the GDP numbers are revised repeatedly. They're revised 3 times when they're first announced, but in addition to that, they're revised the following July, and now they're revised each July for 5 years. There's a 5-year kind of moving window when based on new information that Bureau of Economic Analysis goes back and revises GDP. So that's one reason why we look at other indicators like employment and not wait for the 5 years to pass to get the relatively final verdict of the revised GDP. Third point, in other countries that rely on the rule of 2 consecutive negative quarters, a revision may mean a turning point that had been declared must now be revised. I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment. And the NBR tries to avoid having to revise numbers, given that people rely on them, researchers and so on. It seems like it would wreak havoc to revise a number. Well, having dissed GDP, I want to say that it does have special significance, and especially in our decision, the decision by the committee to call a trough, to call an end of a recession. So allow me a digression on this subject, on how an illustration of how important GDP can be in deciding to call a trough. You might have noticed from the table that the lag between the time that the trough occurs and the time the NBR calls it has been especially longer when it's declaring a trough and even then declaring a peak. And so the recovery has to be underway on average 19 months in the last 3 recoveries before the NBR makes the call. What's the reason for that? Well, even when a trough has occurred, the committee asks itself, okay, we're pretty sure a trough occurred, but hypothetically, what if this expansion were suddenly interrupted? What if next month the economy tanked? Not especially likely, no reason to think it, but it could happen. And would we, in that hypothetical event, say a new recession had begun, or would we, in retrospect, say this was a continuation of the same old recession? Well, until we can satisfy ourselves, until the recovery has been long enough and strong enough to satisfy ourselves that a new downturn would count as a separate recession, we try to hold off on calling the end of the first recession, on calling the trough. And so if output has not yet recovered 2/3 of its previous peak, for example, and again, I refer you to the case of Italy, we consider that a reason to hold off on calling the trough. And the reason is we don't want to have to go back and revise the date. We would if we had to, and we have considered it sometimes, but the committee has avoided revising a date, and I think that's desirable. Okay, now, why is it that each time the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee declares a turning point, it gets asked, why do we need a committee? Why do we need a Business Cycle Dating Committee? This is a question that earlier I said I would elaborate on subsequently. There are two variants of this question. One is, you geniuses just with a fanfare announced a recession that everyone else had figured out a long time ago. Why are you only getting around now to saying it long after everyone else? And indeed, in that table, the average lag between a turning point and an announcement was 12 months. The second variant of the question is, why shouldn't the U.S. do what everyone else does? Just follow the rule of 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth constitutes a recession. Well, these two critiques are often unknowingly contradict each other. The recession that, quote, everybody knows that we've been in often would not pass a 2-quarter rule according to the initial GDP statistics. Again, I'll refer you to the recession of 2001. Clearly, the 2-quarter rule has both pros and cons compared to the committee's less mechanical approach. One advantage of following a rule is that it appears more objective. No one's going to argue about it. Another one is that the public learns of the turning point within a few months of it happening, as opposed to having to wait a year. As soon as the GDP statistics are compiled, you get a ruling as to whether there was a recession. The huge disadvantage of the 2-quarter rule is that when the GDP statistics are revised, as they always are, they may require a retroactive revision of a cyclical turning point that had already been declared. So to take one example, there was a recession in the United Kingdom in 2011 and 2012, 2 negative quarters. At least there was for a while. But it had to be erased from the record the following year, June 2013, when the GDP numbers were revised. Well, that means that claims that were made in good faith by government officials or politicians or economists or business people or researchers turned out no longer to be true, and that's a disadvantage. I think, if I'm not mistaken, France also in 2013 had to erase an earlier recession due to revisions of GDP statistics. So, I mean, the reason why the NBR waits so long and looks at all the other data rather than just 2 consecutive quarters before dating a trough or peak is so that we can be reasonably sure that we will not have to revise the turning point ruling subsequently. By the way, I mentioned Japan as the other country where officially, and this is actually within the government, they have a panel that looks at lots of things, not just GDP. And they similarly have a substantial lag of a year or so before they rule on whether there was a trough or a peak. I think for the same reason. Again, if we had to, if there was a sufficient revision after we declared a turning point that we felt it was necessary to revise it, we would. It's just more desirable not to do it, more desirable to avoid the confusion, and we've never done it. Our business cycle dating committee is not to be quick. There's lots of other agencies and economists and commentators whose goal is to be quick, be the first ones to declare a recession. But that's not the goal of the NBR. The goal of the NBR is to be definitive. The last thing I'd like to talk about is another much more fundamental reason why many countries should consider abandoning the rule that a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Some countries experience sharp slowdowns, one would like to recognize in a business cycle dating chronology, and yet their long-term trend growth rates are either so high or so low that the negative growth rule doesn't give you the answer, doesn't capture what we think of as a downturn. And let me illustrate with examples of 3 countries, Japan, Australia, and China. So consider first a country where the rule would yield excessively frequent revisions. In Japan, population growth is negative, way down, and productivity growth is not what it used to be. And the result is growth averaged only 1% per year in recent decades. Well, what that means is even a pretty small downward fluctuation, it might even be a pretty random event, can send Japan's GDP into negative growth territory. It doesn't take much to get 2 consecutive negative quarters. That's the reason why the 2-quarter rule would suggest 6 or 7 recessions in Japan between 1993 and 2015. That's a recession every 3 years or 4 years. And I'm not sure that that's what we really mean by recession. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the Japanese government has moved away from the rule of thumb, the 2 consecutive negative quarters. Now consider the opposite problem. Consider a place where the rule yields infrequent recessions. Australia is famous to some extent for holding the world record of the length of expansion. They're at 28 years and still counting. Now, to be sure, Australia has earned its success. I would say it has a successful economy, and it's done some things to earn that. Structural reforms were begun in the 1980s, general openness to trade, move to floating exchange rates. I think these policies have stood them in good stead. Having said that, one reason why Australia has gone 28 years without any recessions is simply that the country's labor force is growing faster than it is in other advanced countries, especially in Europe and East Asia. So a 2% downturn that would put Japan into negative territory does not put Australia into negative territory. Finally, consider the example of China, which has not had an outright recession in almost as long, 26 years. 1993 was the last time. Well, China, of course, has experienced remarkably strong growth. But if you consider the Great Recession, it was a substantial downturn in China. It was an 8 percentage point decrease in GDP growth from 14% in 2007 to 6% at one point in 2009. Now, that wasn't enough to cause Chinese output to shrink absolutely, so it doesn't count as a recession. The reason, of course, is the trend growth rate has been very high. And to some extent, that's true of most developing countries, emerging market countries, that their average growth rate is high enough that they don't experience recessions as often. The IMF, in its most recent World Economic Outlook, announced a 3% average world growth. The IMF's criterion for a global recession is not 0, because that almost never happens. Maybe it just barely happened in the Great Recession of 2008. But other than that, it really doesn't happen. The IMF, their guideline for declaring a global world recession is growth dips below 2.5%, and perhaps individual countries should have rules like that. Well, to conclude, there are unquestionably substantial advantages in having an automatic procedure that is simple and transparent, like the two-quarter rule, especially since the alternative is delegating the job to a committee of unelected, unaccountable ivory tower economists. Although you can do it inside the government, make them a little more accountable, as in Japan. But in any case, I hope I've shed some light on the arguments in favor of having such a committee nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll wait for you to come back.
I'm here.
Hi. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Wonderful. Your insightful and very comprehensive explanation of the working of the dating committee of the MBR, and especially your explanation on why we shouldn't go for the simplistic rule of GDP. Very much welcome, because we have to deal every day with that issue. So thanks. Now, I'd like to tap on, it's more than questions, I think they are queries, and we're very fortunate that you have 25 years of experience in dating committees, and at the same time, more than 5 years as member of the Council of Economic Advisors of the President. So I would like to ask on your views from those two sides of your career, say the academic, the one that dated 25, that was working for 25-year dating cycles, and also as a policy advisor at the greatest level of political power in your country. And my questions deal with three issues. The first one is very much on the same line as Professor Whale started putting on this table. The issue between having a very relevant, independent assessment but very imprecise on the current state of the economy for public debate, or having a very precise assessment on past states of the economy that are not very much relevant for the public debate. This idea of having a business cycle committee that has the two missions, dating turning points and also providing timely assessment of the current state of the economy. I wonder, well, first of all, what's your opinion on whether Mexico should have both missions? And also, if you could share with us some of your views or one anecdote or a special experience in your time when, as a policymaker or as an academic, the views of the dating committee of the MBER had an impact on policy decisions or in the public debate in the United States. That would be one. Essentially, what's your view on the dual mission that Professor Whale was suggesting we should have? And if you could tell us of an important part of the public debate in the United States where the mere existence of the dating committee made a difference. Second, and it's very much related to the previous one, it's the communication strategy of the cycling dating committee. Should we, or say Mexico, should we have the commitment to produce periodical press releases, say once a year, twice a year, or should we just be silent until we find that a turning point has happened, say 6 months ago, 7 months ago, whatever, i.e., should we have the press releases on a periodical fixed date, or should they be just sporadical? And in addition to that, and thanks for, this is an idea that came to us from the experience of Spain. Should Mexico's committee, when we, or whoever is in the committee, identifies a turning point, should the committee add an explanation of the causes of that turning point? I mean, what caused the recession? It's very easy when the recession is exogenous because you can blame the oil price, whatever. But when the recession may be due to policy mistakes, perhaps the political risk of the dating committee increases exponentially. And finally, on the working day-to-day business of the business cycle committee, I mean, what's your view on having long terms for members of the committees? I suppose that 25 years is great, but I don't know whether you would suggest that Mexico should have committee members of 25 years, 5 years. Should they be fixed dates? Should they be rotations? We really don't know. And in addition to that, Should the meetings be set, at least a yearly meeting, let's say in June, whenever? And should the meetings be face-to-face? Because now with modern technology, it's great to have you here. We wish you were here and we could teach you more Spanish and at Tequila, the San Angelin, wherever you would like to go. Face-to-face meetings they're very cheap in one sense, but also they're very, limited. So in your experience, that committee should go to face-to-face meetings, etc. And the final question is, the composition of the committee. We are starting from scratch. Should we just have a Facebook open announcement for, please, if you're a great econometrician and a specialist in business cycles, come and join us? Or should we try to tap on experts that say they know the labor market or they know the industrial market or they know exports, and not necessarily, all of them must obviously know econometrics, but tapping more on say more ample base of knowledge. And finally, when you were talking about the gross domestic output and the gross domestic product and things like that, in a country like Mexico that doesn't grow or grows at 0.00 whatever, should it be, and in a country where we depend a lot on remittances from abroad that are 3% of GDP or more, should we start thinking of not only measuring, say, well, including the gross national income besides gross domestic product, in the sense of trying to measure the state of the economy? Thank you very much. We're very grateful for your presentation and for you being here and dealing with my Spanglish. Your turn.
Okay, so thank you for those kind words and for those excellent questions. The quantity and quality of the questions, I'm not sure I can do justice to. But first, you referred to my experience as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I'm sure many at your conference have had government experience in addition to more academic experience, and it is, of course, it is quite different. The frequency, the speed with which things operate in government is every day. You have the president and the cabinet has to make decisions, and very different than the academic time scale. At least in the case of the NBR Business Cycle Dating Committee, it is on a much longer time scale. It's a great committee to be on from an academic viewpoint because most of the time it doesn't meet. It's not just when a recession happens; it's when it might be time to call a recession, which is not very often. So we go for years and years without meeting, without even having much communication by telephone. Sometimes for years, if it's not relevant. I think that there are lots and lots of bodies and institutions, both in the government and outside the government, who try to be quick, whose job is to, as I see it, is to read the latest data. And I would say there's excessive attention paid to monthly data. I'd like to see a lot more reporting of statistics, on a 1 year, 12-month average, for example, just to cut down the amount of attention to what are really quite noisy monthly indicators. But that's beside the point. There will inevitably be a lot of attention paid to the latest indicators and speculation as to whether that means we're in a recession or not. So I see the role, at least thinking of it from the perspective of the NBR Business Cycle Dating Committee, as being very limited. As Philippe Weil said, no prediction, virtually no comment at all, except if you look at the press announcements, most of them have been announcing that a peak happened at a particular date, and so this constitutes the beginning of a recession, or announcing that a trough happened at a particular date, which means it's the end of a recession, and no speculation as to the causes. A little bit of detail, perhaps, about the reasoning that the committee used, and you always have to explain that a recession is defined as the economy getting worse, and when you reach the trough and it starts to climb back, people are surprised that you say the recession is over, and you have to explain recession is means that things are getting worse. When we call a trough, we could just as easily say things are rock bottom. It doesn't. You can use that phrase. Things are at rock bottom, or you could say we're in an expansion phase. They're just two different sides of the same coin. So there are things to explain, and occasionally there are press releases in between if there's a lot of questions being asked. Occasionally, the committee puts out a press release to explain why we're not yet making a call or whatever. But I would suggest not having regular biannual meetings, not commenting on other things, not only refraining from forecasting, but also refraining from signing reasons, because I think you really want it to be authoritative. You asked a very difficult question. When I was I took leave from the committee to be on the Council of Economic Advisors in the late 90s. Is there a time when we found the pronouncements of the committee useful? Well, the period when I was in the Clinton administration was a 10-year recovery where there were no recessions, there were no calls, so there was nothing really to react to. But I would say that in that role and other roles, just as a commentator and watching other commentators, it's very useful to have an commonly agreed upon methodology. If you want to make a statement like there have been twice as many recessions when my political opponent's party has been in power as when my party has been in power, people will want to make such statements. There should be an agreed upon chronology. It shouldn't be up to the speaker to define what counts as a recession or not, because that would be just very, very muddy. So I see that. And for the econometricians, that's you don't want to have to have your whole analysis, your whole well-established econometric result overturned by some revision in the dates. So I think that answers your first question and your second question. That I'm saying the committee should be silent most of the time. Your third question on what causes a recession, I would say no. That's the job of a Council of Economic Advisors or the cabinet or the president or and certainly the private media and business and business commentators. All of them are going to be commenting on that. On the length of terms, the reason I did step down last month was because 25 years seemed like enough, and they give other people a chance, and the committee was getting too big. I've got sort of mixed feelings. The NBR is moving towards, in its other aspects, which of course most of what the NBR does is longer term research. With affiliates from universities throughout the U.S. They have different programs. I was director of the program International Finance and Macroeconomics, and originally I was appointed to the committee, I think, to represent the international sector. You mentioned when you're going around, if Mexico is building a committee, should they get people with expertise in different areas like, labor and so on? And I think there's something to be said for that. But it also, I stepped down from running the IFM program, International Finance and Macro program, and shortly thereafter, because 25 years was enough. And I think the NBR is moving to a model of having people for much shorter terms. And I can see the virtue of that. The disadvantage is that institutional memory is lost, and the committee's only declared 5 recessions, 10 turning points since 1978. And I'm the second, I guess I was the third longest serve on the committee. The first two were Bob Hall and Bob Gordon, but having the memory of what we did last time, because for example, when you're new at it, there's a tendency to just sort of jump the gun and say everybody's asking, we need to declare a turning point, and it takes a little longer term perspective to be calm and say, well, let's wait. We know we're not going to be the first ones anyway, so let's wait until we're pretty sure. Which doesn't mean that you should wait forever. There comes a point where the chance that you'd have to revise it is so small that you better go ahead. Because if you just wait much longer than a year, if you wait 2 years, people are just going to laugh at you. What else? Length of terms, meetings set in advance, face to face. We did not meet in person very often. Most often it was video conference or something like that, typically, if there was a issue arose of a likelihood of a turning point, we'd have a lot more email interactions and a lot more telephone interactions that would build up into a video conference and sometimes into an actual in-person meeting, which often depended on when it was convenient, around the AEA, American Economic Association annual meetings, or some event in Washington where most of the people were, or in Cambridge, where the NBR headquarters were, where most people were going to be present anyway, would be the occasion to have an in-person meeting. But I don't think in-person is necessary, especially now when we see how well a video conferencing technology works. It's pretty well. I think in-person meeting is not absolutely necessary. What else did you ask? Composition of the committee. I wouldn't advertise on Facebook. You want to maximize.
I wouldn't either.
You want to maximize credibility and confidence, not sure that advertising on Facebook would be the way to do that. So far, I think we're lucky that no one has called into question the composition of the NBER committee. It's up to the president of the NBER, and the choices have been NBR members who are experts in mostly macroeconomics, but sometimes with specialties, whether it's econometrics or monetary economics, or in my case, international economics. No one has questioned that, and I hope that continues. Although there are, if you look at what's happened to other institutions whose independence has been questioned in the last 2 years in a way that is undesirable, in my view. One might be worried about that. So I don't know. I mean, I think having some sort of government imprimatur is important, but having some sort of independence is important too. So there's analogies with central banks, where there's tend to be a lot of economic expertise, but we think it's important that the central bank have some independence. Your last question, Mexico does it, and I know I share the frustration that Mexico GDP doesn't seem to be growing over the decades at the rate that one would think based on fundamentals. My initial reaction when you ask about remittances and using national income is that recession means domestic economic activity. If you receive remittances or other income from abroad, to my mind, that doesn't count. I mean, it's very useful to have, very important, but doesn't count, and it has feed-through effects through domestic GDP. But to my mind, that would not be the variable to look at. Did I miss any of your questions?
I don't think so. Thank you very much. But now you have more questions from the floor. Please. ¿Quién quiera preguntar? Eva, empezamos con una mujer.
Thank you, Professor Frankel. This is Eva Ortega from the Dating Committee of the Business Cycle in Spain. I was just curious, you said that you gather only when you feel there is a a call to be made on a turning point. So how is the decision to meet done? Who decides when to meet?
Well, when it appears likely, not that a recession will occur in the future, but when it appears at least possible that it has already started, there is an increase in emails that we have go from zero. For years, you could have zero email traffic, and then there's just sort of a building process of more and more communication by email, and then at some point it would be the chairman of the committee, who is still Bob Hall of Stanford University, who would declare that let's schedule a teleconference at a particular time, or these days probably a video conference. So it's his call, but it is a collegial committee, and the opinions of the members about how likely they think it is that we're ready to call it or not are factor very heavily in the decision whether to meet. And we might have a meeting and decide. Talk about through all the issues and decide we're not ready yet. We think there's a good chance that a turning point occurred, but there's still too much uncertainty. And so let's, some plan of action, like let's wait another few months and wait till such and such information comes out. In the case of calling a trough, it might be let's wait till GDP reattains a point which is 75% of its previous peak, something like that, and then have a second meeting when the time comes.
We have another question.
Thank you, Professor Frankel. It's a great presentation. It's an honor to hear your presentation directly from a member of the MBR committee. My question is very simple. When you read about the decision of about a turning point, etc., everybody says the decision of the committee, but how is the decision made? I mean, how is it? How is a meeting of this committee? What do you do? How does the meeting start? How do you bring to the committee econometricians, bring estimations? How is it? Because for many of us, that is like a black box. So please.
Pablo Mejia from the committee.
Pablo Mejia from Mexico, yes.
So, I will say that we now on the committee have two high-powered econometricians, have had for a while, Jim Stock and Mark Watson, who have studied these issues from a high-powered econometric viewpoint, whereas most of the rest of us had not done so. And possibly the result, there'll be techniques, methodology that becomes more rigorous from an academic viewpoint as a result. The committee, even though Stock and Watson were on the committee, they weren't quite ready to say we have a model that declares things. It was give and take. It was people arguing what's the relative importance of looking at GDP versus looking at employment. What special factors might be at work. I would say that each time there was some disagreement, particularly in the initial meetings. It wasn't like everybody saw things the same way. But I would say each time, by the time we made the final call, we were pretty unanimous. No one felt the need to write a dissenting report or anything. And perhaps that's another reason. I would say very much a secondary reason, but perhaps maybe the reason the lag seemed long is we were waiting for a agreement. But I would say it was a collaborative process, people making different points, both at early stages via email exchanges and telephone conferences, and then in the final meeting. Excuse me. It's very different than an academic exercise, even though it's at a longer time scale, and in that respect is like an academic exercise. It's you got to look at everything, and when you're writing academic papers to publish in journals, you sort of have to pretend that your model is the one correct model. But when you're doing this other exercise, you're recognizing that a lot of different factors are relevant and different approaches have have virtue. I just have to weigh up the evidence.
Thank you very much. Jeff, thank you very much for your time and your knowledge. I'm sure this is only the first time, but not the last time. We wish you a nominal winter, not a real winter. That tends to happen in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And, well, good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to participate.